remember the old times, and once again, march together as a unit. In 1942, America had just entered World War II. Secret plans began circulating among the Allies calling for a specially trained commando unit. In June, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Frederick of the War Department General Staff, who had worked on the initial plan, was made commander of the yet unnamed group. Frederick wanted his men ready for a target date in late December. The unit would include both U.S. and Canadian troops in the spirit of Allied cooperation. This film, taken by Army photographers and owned by the 1st Special Service Force Association, is the only record of the group's secret training. In addition to rigorous physical training, the men would concentrate on parachute, weapons, demolitions, skiing, rock climbing, and cold weather combat, as well as operation of an experimental snow vehicle called the Weasel. The unit would be the most elite fighting force ever formed in American or Canadian Army history.
Well, they told me it was a force of extremely hazardous duty. We were going to parachute, and we'd be committed on these hazardous missions probably before the year was out, and that was 1942.
Right in the middle of a class, I was asked to report to the headquarters. After arriving, I was interviewed by a Major Wickham, who identified himself as the adjutant of the 1st Special Service Force, Plow Project, as they called it in those days. And he shoved a paper in front of me and he said, is this your signature? I said, yes. He says, you have been selected to join the Plow Project in Helena, Montana. You have 4 hours to clear this post and be on your way.
The only criteria at the time was you had to have had some experience in cold weather living, or snow and skis. And of course, having been born in northern Minnesota, cold weather was no stranger to me, so I volunteered.
Frederick decided that Fort William Henry Harrison in Helena, Montana offered the best training opportunities.
Having arrived the day before, we went to the Placer Hotel and spent the night, and they was supposed to report the next morning. Well, this fellow's name was Lieutenant Brown, and he said, let's go out to the fort and see what we're getting into. I said, no, tomorrow's soon enough. He said, well, I'm going to go take a cab and go out. And he didn't come back, and didn't come back, and didn't come back. And about 2 o'clock in the morning, he shows up, and he's pretty well looped. I said, this is a heck of a note. You get tanked before we have to report. And he says, well, you see what we're getting into.
Well, it was a rather bleak place. And although I think, having been forewarned of what I expected, why we were issued a sleeping bag and had a tent, so we slept on the floor there. No stoves in the tents or anything like that. It looks pretty rugged, you know.
On July 2nd, 1942, the War Department activated the 1st Special Service Force. An insignia of crossed arrows and a shoulder patch of a red spearhead with a white USA and Canada were chosen. With the preliminaries out of the way, it was time to move the force to Helena. American recruits were picked up all over the West by train.
It was a secret train, all blacked out. We couldn't get off, nor did anybody else get on except at designated points. And I think the train, we could kind of conjure up directions. It went south, and it went east, and it went north, and then finally west, and came to a stop, and the doors opened, and the first thing we spotted were the twin towers of the cathedral. So we knew it was Helena, Montana.
When the men arrived, work on Fort Harrison was continuing. It was not what the men expected.
We had visions of tree-lined boulevards and this type, and when we showed up, it's tents and a few permanent barracks with dust up above your ankles, a lot of construction going on.
Well, that year it was awful dry. It looked like partly desert, you know, we got here. But the camp itself was all tents, you know. They had the tents set up then.
We reported in. They assigned us to a tent, gave us a pair of coveralls, a pair of jump boots, and told us to report back in 15 minutes. We reported back. They said, right face, double time march, and we never quit running from that time on.
Within 2 weeks of arrival in Helena, each recruit was already up in a C-47 aircraft preparing for his first parachute jump.
No, I think it was better that way, really. You didn't have the tower. A lot of people are afraid of heights that will jump out of airplanes. But the tower weed a lot of people out.
The pre-jump training, I don't know whether that's all that necessary or not. If they teach you how to land, mainly.
Everybody's scared. Anybody that tells you that they weren't scared in jumping is crazy. They're not telling the truth.
First jump was absolutely no problem. You just bailed out. But you were a little apprehensive on the second and third.
Our call was Geronimo, or was Powder River instead of Geronimo, in keeping with Montana. When I went out the door, we're supposed to yell Powder River to kind of relieve the tension and look up, see your canopies open, and it was a fairly low-level jump. We thought it was awful low level, but it was considered quite high. After we got on the ground, this Major Pierce came over to me and he says, "What was that you yelled when you went out the door?" And I said, "Judas Priest."
The accelerated parachute program separated the sheep from the goats. Those who wouldn't jump or were seriously injured were transferred out of the force, usually the same day.
The biggest share of them that left the outfit was because they wouldn't jump. And the biggest share of those that refused to jump were pushed out anyway, and after they once did it, a lot of them would repeat it. But if they didn't jump, when the plane landed at the Helena airport, by the time you jumped and got your chute back to the packing sheds and got back to your quarters, they were gone.
While the American troops were already beginning conditioning and parachute training, the Canadians were still on their way from reception centers in Ottawa and Winnipeg. By mid-August, 2 Canadian units were in place and had completed the jump program. August 15th, Colonel Frederick awards 1,200 men with jump qualification badges at a parade in front of the city of Helena. It was the first time the entire force ranked up and counted off, but it was the jump badge, or buzzard clause, that really excited the men.
Well, it was quite an honor for us, you know, to become a parachute troop with 2 jumps, you know.
Well, it was great, and it meant $50 a month more, which was even greater. So that's primarily what a lot of them went for, was the jump pay.
What was a day like for the 1st Special Service Force? Reveille sounded at 4:45. By 8, mess and calisthenics were over, and the troops were in the middle of running a 1.25 mile obstacle course. Following a 1-hour lunch, training continued until 5. 4 nights a week, required lectures were held from 7 to 9. Promptness and speed were strictly enforced. Coming late to training was inexcusable. Those who couldn't make it were transferred out.
An awful lot of people that couldn't march long distances. There were an awful lot of people that couldn't parachute, and there are an awful lot of people that couldn't stand the cold weather, and others that couldn't ski, and it was an easy way to weed them all out, you know.
Intense competition existed between regiments. Colonel Frederick set up a 60-mile course and held marching competitions.
There's a little mountain behind Fort Harrison called Pine Mountain. Their main deal was to have us get up there as fast as we could, one unit going up one side and one unit up the other to see who could get there first.
Well, it was all real strenuous physical training. And you take off across country double time, and it was just amazing how strung out your platoon would be, or your company would be, by the time you got to your destination, which might be the hilltop 2 or 3 miles away.